I'm Frank James. I'm chair of SHAC. This is the final online seminar of the year. It is both on Zoom and on YouTube. On Zoom, could everybody go to mute, please? And Matthew will give us a talk for sort of 20, 30 minutes and then 30 minutes of discussion. If you're on YouTube, put your questions in the chat function and they'll be passed to me, because we can't sort of never quite worked out how to communicate with the YouTube stream. Zoom participants can draw attention to having a question in the chat box, and then I'll just call them in order. So this month's seminar has been given by Matthew Daniel Eddy, who is a cultural and intellectual historian of modern Europe. He's worked previously at MIT, Harvard, and the Max Planck Institute of History of Science in Berlin. And he is currently a professor, and has been professor for some time actually, at Durham University. And he also holds chairs in Caltech and Uppsala. At Durham, he's also co-director of the Institute for Medieval and Early Modern Studies, and next term he will be visiting Cambridge at Corpus Christi College and Department of HPS to sort of carry on his new project. His research addresses the cultural history of science in modern Britain and its former empire, and he's especially interested in how different social groups use experimental science and its attendant media technologies to make competing knowledge claims about nature and the body. Last year, he published Media and the Mind, Art, Science, and Notebooks as Paper Machines, 1700 to 1830, which in the conversation we had just had, he described as his big book. So, and it is a big book, I have to say. And previously, he wrote Language and Mineralogy, John Walker Chemistry, and the Edinburgh Medical School, 1750 to 1800. He's also edited several books, including Reverse Decline, Cultural History of Chemistry in the 18th Century, which I reviewed in the BJHS very favorably, I have to say. Now, whether that's reviews out or not, since CUP had a cyber attack, I'm not entirely sure, but never mind. And his current project that he'll be working on over the next few years, starting off in Cambridge, is entitled Information Against Empire: Black Doctors, Biodata, and Democracy in the Atlantic World, 1750 to 1900. But today he's talking about York, a very curious subject, Jane Ewbank, Public Lectures on Experimental Philosophy in Late Georgian York. Over to you, Matthew.
So thank you very much, Frank, for that introduction. And let me just click to make sure I can see myself here. Okay. So thank you for inviting me to talk today. It's a pleasure to be back at SHAC. I have been sort of involved with SHAC for many years, ever since my PhD. So it's wonderful to be back in the community again. And thank you for inviting me to speak. Can I just make sure everybody can see my slides? Do we have a nice sort of clear view of the first slide on your screen? Just maybe someone give me a thumbs up. Anyone? Great. Okay. So I'm just going to kick it off. So I thought, my paper today is entitled A Very Curious Subject, Jane Ewbank, Public Lectures and Experimental Philosophy in Late York. And I thought I would just give you a brief overview of how I came to this topic, and then give the paper. So let me see if so this project the project Frank mentioned is is a project on Black doctors, which is one of my big projects, but I also have a very long-standing project and a long-standing interest in gender, media, and science. And I explored this topic quite a bit, actually, in my recent book that Frank mentioned, by looking at the notebooks of girls, particularly, and how they used notebooks to learn scientific topics, and how the act of making the notebook itself, the physical act, the material culture, the visual culture, also helped them learn about science in the natural world. And I have two examples from my book here. One's from Jemima Arrow. It's a map book that was made right about the same time as that I'll be covering today, in early decades of the 19th century, and then another one by Amelia Kerr, excuse me, the daughter of James Kerr, the chemist, who had immigrated to England. And so that's the background of this. I'm constantly collecting notebooks and material culture, particularly notebooks, and hopefully at one point in the distant future, I will publish a book on gender, media, and science. And I've also got some current projects on this. I'm looking at Lady Charlotte Murchison, for example, and how she used her notebook as a field manual in the early part of the 19th century to collect and understand fossils and to think about the very long history of the Earth. So today's paper that I'll be giving is part of a larger project that I'm well, it's the actual project's been going on for a while. We're entering the final editing stages of a book, and it's a project that I'm been very fortunate to do with two extremely talented historians based at York, Rachel Feldberg and Jane Rendall. And it stems from the diary you see on the right of Jane Ewbank, which was it's been in the National Library of Scotland for quite some time, but it was Jane Rendall who realized that it offers some really interesting insights into the life, the intellectual life of a woman living in provincial York. And several years ago, she was in touch to say that the diary had this big section on experimental philosophy, chemistry type lectures. And I was wondering if I'd like to be involved. And that led to a big project on Ewbank, using her diary to look at gender science and sociability for a provincial woman in early 19th century Yorkshire. And they'll have a number of papers in it. We've had a workshop. It's going to be published by Bordell and Brewer. This is just a mock-up of the cover. The costuming, as I've been told by Rachel Feldberg, is a bit too early for us. But this is the idea, and this is the project that my paper comes from. These are my two collaborators here. Jane's on top, and Rachel is on the bottom. And we've got about 7 or 8 chapters that look at everything from theater. Jane Ewbank went to the theater, to walks and natural history type journeys to different parts of the Northern England, and also how her life intersected with the history of colonialism and race. So it's a fabulous project, and hopefully it will be out in about a year's time. So now on to my paper. So in September 1809, the artist Thomas Rowlandson and Auguste Charles Pugin published a popular print depicting the audience which had recently attended the public experimental philosophy course given in London's Surrey institution. And as you can see here from the slide, every seat is full, and the audience stares with anticipation at the lecturer. Notably, at least half of the attendees were women and girls. And though historians have observed that this was a common phenomenon at the time, studies which address the individual motivations and reactions of female attendees to the scientific ideas presented in such lectures have received less attention. So who were these women? How did their lives outside the lecture hall lead them to be interested in scientific topics? And which lectures did they find interesting? And this paper explores these questions. It's based on my chapter in the book with Jane and Rachel, and explores these questions in reference to her journal, Jane Ewbank's journal, which was kept from 1803 to 1805 by Ewbank in York. As shown in the other chapters of the book that we're currently editing on this topic, Jane led a robust social, religious, and intellectual life. Like many women depicted in the figure here on the screen, she was also interested in science, and her journal offers unique insight into how women used public lectures and polite conversation to learn about experimental philosophy in a provincial city. I'm trying to change my slide, and it doesn't want to move now. Wait, there we go. So Jane's interest in scientific topics is consistent with recent scholarship on the relationship between gender and science during the long 18th century. The pages of her journal offer an informative account of a conscious and informed project of self-education of the kind that was practiced by many middle-class women living in Georgian Britain and its North American colonies. She was especially interested in experimental philosophy, and her journal reveals that she attended numerous public lectures that addressed scientific topics. Two lecturers who captured her attention were Charles Sylvester, who's on the right, and Henry Moyes on the left. Her journal's account of Moyes' course, in particular, is the fullest set of extant notes from the time period known to be taken by a provincial woman attending experimental philosophy lectures. In what remains of this paper, I explore why she was interested in such lectures by contextualizing her life in reference to the different forms of communication through which provincial women learned about science and its relationship to society. So this is part of my chapter in the book that I just mentioned. I'm not going to be speaking about everything I talk about in the chapter, so it's more of a summary. These are the titles of the sections of the chapter, and I'm going to be focusing on two of which, one, Grace in Animation, which looks at Henry Moyes' lectures, her reaction to them, and then her reaction to Charles Sylvester's galvanism lectures. So let's look at Moyes. So in early November 1804, the advertisement section of the York Current announced, quote, "The inhabitants of York and its vicinity, and the subscribers in particular, are respectfully informed that Dr. Moyes will commence the delivery of a course of lectures on the following interesting subjects on or before the 12th instant in the large room in Blake Street." The admission for the full course was 1 guinea, which was worth about £1 and a shilling. The cost of a single lecture was 2 shillings. And this price would have been unrealistic for working class attendees or even in middle class women from families with multiple children and infirm relatives who required financial assistance. But it does go to show that Ewbank lived a comfortable life and that she was content to use her she wasn't wealthy, but to use the money that she had to invest in her own self-education. Moyes illustrated the topics covered in his course with experiments, a practice that required an assistant to transport specialized apparatus to the towns where he lectured. And Ewbank attended this course from the autumn until the early winter, from about November until about January. As indicated in prints of other contemporary traveling experimentalists, such as those who lectured in the Surrey institution we've just seen, experimental philosophy lecture instruments function both as symbols and as facilitators of scientific knowledge to the audience. Based on drawings created by a notekeeper attending Moyes' North American lectures, Jane's experience of the lectures was probably enhanced by instruments ranging from simple mixing bowls to more specialized glassware such as prisms and Florentine flasks, which is an image of the Florentine flasks in the center picture on the slide here. Following the lead of Scottish professors, it is also likely that Moyes used posters. His American lectures indicate that he had used a prism, which these two images here on the screen of notebook is a notebook kept in his lectures in Philadelphia. And you can see on the bottom right image that the notekeeper was drawing a prism, splitting a white light into an array of colors, demonstrating Newton's discovery that light is comprised of many colors and that white is actually a combination of them all. Moyes gave this particular prism demonstration in the York lectures. It's noted by Ewbank in her diary, and as we'll see, she asked him, we won't see, but as I talk about in my paper, she does ask him about it when she meets him for tea later on. But more about tea in a bit. So for attendees who wish to take detailed lecture notes, Moyes offered a 16-page printed syllabus titled A Syllabus of a Course of Lectures on the Philosophy of Natural History, and the title page is listed here on the slide. The syllabus listed the headings, which I have typed out here for you, and then when you paged through the syllabus, each one of these headings had 6 to 12 subheadings that gave you the topics of each lecture. Upon arriving at the first lecture, Jane had planned to take notes in her memorandum book, which has been lost, because this is where she would normally record her what she called philosophical facts during the conversations or while she was traveling. But even though she wanted to take notes, Moyes' quick style of speaking prevented her from taking them during the lecture, and that led her to listen more intently and to watch the experiments more closely. And she talks about how she wished he would have spoken slower. He would have spoken slower. So, whereas Moyes' headings were phrases, those offered by other contemporary lecturers like Thomas Garnett, for example, used whole entire sentences. And I should probably mention that she had seen Garnett's lectures as well, probably the previous year, but we don't have diary entry explaining what exactly she witnessed. We don't have an image of Moyes lecturing, but the apparatus and performance witnessed by Ewbank would have been very similar to that depicted in the Pugin print that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. The presence of many subheadings in the syllabus made it possible for attendees to follow along with the paper version and the words, and as they watched the types of demonstrations being conducted in each lecture. So it was an efficient multimedia type of experience. So take, for instance, the subheadings that were used in lecture 9, which addressed thunder and lightning. These probably were of interest to Jane, not only because the topic she mentions was one of her favorites, but she also, for this lecture, decided to bring her 10-year-old niece, Elizabeth Lodge, with her to witness these experiments, which is one of the few instances where we have someone writing about bringing a young girl with them to a lecture of this kind, and even more rare in the fact that we know what the lecture was about, which was thunder and lightning. And these lectures connected familiar phenomenon in the natural world to theories and principles of experimental science. Numerous entries in Jane's journal, and I could also probably show you here, this is the syllabus entry for that particular lecture where she took her 10-year-old niece. We can see the subjects listed there. I'll leave that up for you. You can see some of the topics. So numerous entries in Jane's journal emphasize that she was thrilled by the content of Moyes' lectures and relished the opportunity to learn new scientific ideas. She much preferred the fluidity of Moyes' grace and animation, even though he talked fast. She preferred his style of demonstrating to Garnett, who she called, who she said used an ungraceful mode of lecturing, and who was automaton-like, that's her word, when he spoke. Ewbank was especially inspired by the parts of Moyes' lectures that made references to natural theology in ways that explicitly connected the order of nature to the existence of a divine orderer. She noted that she was especially pleased with the experiments relating to the composition of the atmosphere and the causes of thunder and lightning, which is what I've got on the slide here, and the other lectures in which Moyes used prisms to reveal the relationship between light and color. She really was taken by those. But the diary also reveals that she learned much about experimental philosophy from Moyes himself, particularly from catching him after a lecture and discussing his ideas. There's a nice little scene where she's quizzing him about thunder and lightning in the diary. And also when Moyes was invited to tea by her friends. This was a common practice at the time. And this mode of oral learning was common for women. And my chapter explores a number of instances of it with Ewbank, and one of which is worth considering now due to its importance to the historiography of experimental science. So soon after Moyes had arrived in town, Ewbank was invited by her friend Harriet Green to have tea with Moyes and with another person, a liberal-leaning theologian named William Berg. And after an initial discussion of scientific topics, Jane notes in her diary that, quote, Dr. Moyes and Dr. Berg talked of chemistry, unquote. Her account of this exchange offers a fascinating snapshot of how the public communication of science played out in real time through dialogue. She recounted how Moyes used his status as a scientific expert to explain that in the year 1789, there had been a, quote, grand era of revolutions, unquote, in politics and in chemistry as well. In addition to serving as the start of the French Revolution, he observed that 1799 had been the year that Antoine Lavoisier had published his Traité élémentaire de chimie, which outlined new theories that played a role in transforming the discipline of chemistry. When writing books or giving talks at wider audience, this double revolution of 1789 was used by other Scottish trained experimentalists at the time as well, even by those who opposed Lavoisier's idea and valued the contributions of other chemists who had played important roles in changing the theory and nomenclature of chemistry. In other words, perhaps Moyes, like other itinerant lecturers around the country, promoted a personal interpretation of scientific chemical progress. And he chose to champion Lavoisier, and even went so far to downplay the contributions of other noteworthy chemists, particularly Joseph Priestley, who, quote, approached to an important discovery without exactly reaching it, unquote. This is Ewbank summarizing Moyes in the conversation. But the interesting thing to note here is that Jane was particularly struck by this account and by other philosophical information that she picked up during the meeting, and so much that she recorded it in her now lost memorandum book, thereby showing how she learned about the history of science and also science at the same time through Moyes's interpretation. So it's a great example of public communication of chemistry. So I'd like now to turn, for some reason, there we go, to Sylvester's galvanism lectures, and which she called a very curious subject. That's where the title comes from. So Moyes's experimental philosophy lectures and conversations inspired Jane Ewbank to be interested in attending further lectures about experimental philosophy. And to this goal, she attended Charles Sylvester's galvanism course of 2 lectures in April 1805. Sylvester was a self-taught civil engineer and experimental philosopher with radical political views who came from humble origins in Sheffield. A true product of the Transpennine Enlightenment, he lectured on experimental topics in the Midlands during the 1800s, or the first early years of the 1800s. The year before Jane attended his York lectures, he had published an article on galvanism that established his reputation as a noteworthy chemist and experimentalist. And the lectures that Ewbank attended in York likely served as the basis of the appendix on galvanism that he eventually included in 1809 in his book on entitled Elementary Treatise on Chemistry, which is what I have here on the slide. And in the center slide, you can see galvanism highlighted where he starts to talk about it there. So galvanism was a new form of science that used electricity to split organic and inert compounds into different kinds of substances. It is likely that Jane heard about this branch of experimental philosophy in Moyes's 5th lecture, entitled, quote, On the Laws and Phenomena of Electrical Fluid, unquote, because he was actively conducting experiments on this topic at the time, Moyes was. Her wider interest in Sylvester's lectures came at a time when galvanism attracted public interest in Britain and its colonies because the electricity stored in galvanic batteries could be used to reanimate, in the words of Sylvester's advertisement in the York Current, quote, recently killed animals, unquote, by sending an electric pulse to the nerve. And outside the world of scientific lectures, Mary Shelley famously tapped this public interest in 1818. And this image I have here is of a corpse rising up that has been shocked by electricity. And Shelley famously tapped this galvanic interest in 1818 with the publication of her novel Frankenstein, in which the eponymous protagonist shocks a corpse to life, creating a creature whose moral and material existence challenged the doctrines of science and religion. Sylvester's lectures were held in the exhibition room on Little Blake Street. His March advertisement in the York Current described his galvanic battery as, quote, an immense apparatus exposing a metallic surface of more than 8,000 square inches, unquote. And with this apparatus, he performed experiments with the new and astonishing principle of electricity, that's his words, and what he also called the galvanic energy, by, quote, burning metals and inflaming other bodies, as well as the influence of this powerful stimulus upon animals sometime after death. And the advertisement then goes on to explain how he used the head and body of a sheep to perform motions of winking, chewing, breathing, and kicking. And this is an example here, contemporary, of the galvanic experiments being conducted on the parts of animals. And on the left is a sheep, which is precisely the kind of experiment that Sylvester was conducting. Since Sylvester's galvanism course was short, he offered it twice. The first one ran on the 27th and 29th of March, and several days later he ran an advertisement in the York Current for the second, and these are advertisements here on the screen. The advertisement announced the first course had been offered. It offered, quote, brilliant and, quote, astonishing experiments. So he's trying to create a bit of positive press for his experiments, and that they had been conducted on metals and animals. It also mentioned that the lectures were conducted to appeal to both men and women as well. So he was definitely aware of the female audience, that the kind that Ewbank event represented. Rather than attending the lectures in order, Jane attended them in reverse. And in her words, she took them, quote, in the backwards way. She attended the second lecture on the 29th of March, and then the first lecture of the second set on the 3rd of April. And this reverse format was linked to the fact that she had accompanied another friend, a woman named Mary Fairfax, née Goodrich, in the first instance, and then decided she wanted to continue, and so she went to the first. Like her initial reaction to Moyes' lecture style, she was critical of Sylvester's presentation skills, particularly the fact that she struggled to understand his thick Sheffield accent. In her view, and this is a quote from the diary, quote, Mr. S. is most sadly deficient in every requisite for a public speaker: bad dialect, no readiness in expressing himself, and no good method of arrangement, unquote. She was very clear about what she thought in the diary. That's why it's so fun reading her. But nevertheless, Ewbank was still impressed by Sylvester's scientific knowledge and his ability to overcome what she termed to be a want of education as a low mechanic. And she concluded, quote, but notwithstanding all this, he appears well acquainted with his subject, and I am told is remarkably intelligent and a clear-headed man, unquote. Unlike her factual summaries of Moyes' lectures, her assessment of the content of Sylvester's lecture is written more confidently, revealing the positive impact of the experimental information she learned from Moyes. She notes, quote, galvanism is certainly a very curious subject, and as far as I can understand, it seems to promise to produce new discoveries in chemistry from its powerful agency in decomposing liquors, unquote. And drawing from her newfound experimental knowledge, she then concludes, quote, but it is impossible for anyone as yet to say what it will produce, because the science is as yet so much in its infancy, one may almost say in its swaddling clothes, unquote. In addition to attending Sylvester's lectures, Jane took the opportunity to discuss his abilities and career with unnamed friends. She mentions that others spoke highly of his intelligence, indicating that she sought knowledge about him outside of the lecture hall from knowledgeable acquaintances. She also sought extra information from others about his research interests, and she mentions in the diary, quote, "I am told that Mr. Sylvester has discovered a means of rendering zinc malleable, which may prove a valuable invention," unquote. Here Jane demonstrates that she was certainly well informed, because later in 1805, Sylvester filed a patent with Charles Hobson, a Sheffield plater, and John Morehouse, a surgeon, that described a new and innovative way to coat metals with zinc, thereby shielding them from the detrimental effects of oxidation. And this was done to see if they could put this on the hulls of ships to prevent barnacles from forming. So that's a summary of her impression of Sylvester. And I'd just like to say a few words in conclusion. So in this paper, we've seen how Jane Ewbank's journal offers helpful insight into the ways in which intellectually inquisitive women learned about science in a provincial English city. Jane not only learned through reading, but through listening to lectures, writing in her journal, and conversing with friends and experts. Her multi-sensory and multimedia mode of learning speaks to the rich process of scientific education that took place outside the masculine world of universities and scholarly societies that often attracts the attention of historians of science. Her experience offers insight into scientific interests that motivated the women depicted in prints about experimental philosophy courses created by artists such as Rowlandson and Pugin, who we saw at the beginning. She helps us better understand a context in which, rather than being the first or only exposure to experimental science, public lectures were embedded in a womanly world of learning that already included scientific ideas and which thrived on the sociable exchange of knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. That was really, really interesting. So I'm going to, well, first of all, say anybody who has a question on Zoom, put up a hand or put something in the chat box, and anybody on YouTube, put in the chat box, and it will also be passed to you. But I'm going to exercise my usual chair's prerogative and ask the first question. As you know, Matthew, Jane Marseille's Conversations in Chemistry was published to accompany Davy's lectures, which sort of suggests to me quite strongly that just attending the lectures themselves was not sufficient to sort of learn anything about chemistry, or to sort of either reinforce it or make it clearer through an elementary textbook. And I'm just wondering whether something similar is going on here, with particularly Moyes' headings and sort of subheadings, that he's sort of trying to sort of get these ideas across in a way that might not just come across in just attending a lecture. And what I'm suggesting is there's a sort of close link between the sort of published guides to a lecture, so to speak, and the lectures themselves. I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that.
I agree. I think that there's a very strong relationship between these published guides and between the how people who wrote them were under the impression of how other people learned. And this is something that I originally came across in my studies on Scottish students that I talk about in the book that I've just published. Every single professor in the Scottish universities, but also this happens in Cambridge and Oxford as well, and in Glasgow and St. Andrews, were really keen to publish the lecture heads to go along with the lectures themselves, because they saw this as an organizational technique of learning a lot of information more easily in a quicker period of time. And I think that's what is happening with Ewbank. I think Moyes has clocked this, because actually in the chapter I go into how much these cost, and they weren't insignificant costs. So someone who was buying these would have really wanted to probably use them. And there are instances of examples of these types of lecture headings having notes on them in various collections around the UK. And there's also Rachel Feldberg has been able to get copies of a set of lecture notes that was annotated by a woman in Moyes lecture notes, these lecture headings, that was annotated by a woman in the US. And so this points to the fact that these headings were aids to learning about chemistry in a similar fashion. I think what you have with Marseille is that it's much more developed and much more sort of aimed specifically at women. But I think that Moyes was doing this as well. It's just that you can't see that in the lecture heads because you don't have the actual transcript. But if you read accounts of people who spoke to Moyes, like women, for instance, in Philadelphia, they all comment on how when he's giving the lecture, he's talking about various things that women would find interesting. So yeah, I agree with you. I think there's a what I call a multimedia aspect of learning going on here, and that these lecture headings, far from being just lists of topics as they were usually treated by historians of chemistry about 20 years before, were actually quite insightful in how people learned chemistry. And the fact that Marseille is writing these is showing that she has clocked this as well and wants other people to learn. There's also a similar type of headings-based approach that's used by Amelie Kerr and her dad when they put together a manuscript of how to teach chemistry to girls. It's organized around these headings, these kinds of headings as well.
Okay, right. Vera Mates, would you like to demute yourself and come on screen? Possibly not. So her question is, what was the peak period for popular attendance at public scientific lectures?
Sorry, what was the period?
What was the peak period for popular attendance at public scientific lectures?
So is that asking when did this start? Maybe I think that
No,
might be what
when was the largest? When were the largest audiences? The way I read
where were
it.
the largest audiences?
When?
Oh,
When?
when? Oh,
Yes.
when? Well, they get bigger as time goes on. And so if we're looking at women, so which is what I'm interested in, you always had women who were around in domestic scientific demonstrations and lectures. So that is, I don't want to say that that's not happening. That's more of an elite thing, though, for women who have means, who have big houses and can bring in well-known experimentalists. There's lots of cases of this in the French salons, for example, starting in the mid 18th century. And there's been a lot of work done on women being part of experiments behind the scenes back to the 17th century, because laboratories were not separated from the houses. They were actually part of the process. But in terms of women attending lectures, the phenomenon, and Frank would probably know more about this than me because of the Royal Institution, but from the 1790s is when it really picks up. And you've got the Royal Institution efforts being made in London, which had eventually big audiences. But you also have in Scotland the Andersonian Institution around the same time, which intentionally is in designing courses that are meant to attract women. So the largest audiences, though, I would imagine, were at places in London, metropolitan settings, not in provincial York, but like, for instance, at the Royal Institution. That's the Davy lectures, for example, famously attracted lots of women right about this time, and also the Surrey Institution as well, which was the image that I showed. So the numbers start to get bigger, 1800 onward. That would be my impression.
And for York, I mean, do these rooms still exist, and you can sort of go and see and have a guess about how many people attended?
So Funny you should ask. So we did originally suspect it was the assembly room, which is still existent in York. It's now it's a restaurant, I believe. It's a very pretty room, and we had a nice image of this that was going to be in the book until we realized that that's not the room that he was using, and that the room, based on archaeologists that we talked to, the room that he was using was around the corner, and that it would have been about a medium-sized room, so not a big ballroom type, but not like a closet or anything. And we're talking probably this room we estimate has been estimated would have sat around 30 or 40 people.
So not a sort of huge RI type number.
No,
I suppose
it wasn't a venue as big as the RI in New York, unless you did it at the cathedral.
But I mean, I suppose proportional to the sort of population size of York and London, give or take.
I agree. And the other thing is that, again, as you know better than I, the Royal Institution was designed to be a big place to do science, sort of purpose built, and like a theater of science effectively. And even the theaters in York weren't that big. And Ewbank attended theaters quite often, so she was familiar with those settings. But it wasn't. I don't think you would have achieved anything larger than that. And York at the time was a big provincial city, it wasn't industrial, but it had a long tradition of public speaking.
No. So Mike Duras on YouTube, his query's been passed to me. So he says Sylvester's 8,000 square inches of metal is about 90 inches by 90 inches. And what was the area used for? I'm not quite sure what Mike's actually asking, because that's the surface area of presumably sort of various Cruikshank troughs. So we could probably do a calculation and estimate how many Cruikshank troughs Sylvester was using. But those don't come cheap. I mean, those are pretty expensive things to make.
That's interesting. So that would be something that I'd like to talk more with you about, because I hadn't actually thought of calculating like that. That's actually quite helpful in terms of the cost and the power of the electricity coming out of it. It clearly was enough to animate animals, but beyond that, I hadn't actually thought. So I'm not sure if this is answering the question, but I think all he needed was enough to shock these animals to life. And I'm not quite sure where it came from. He doesn't say anything about where he got it, how he designed it. I've looked at his chemistry notes on galvanism. It's more of just a explanation of how it works, not how to make one. So I'm not sure if that's answering the question.
There were scientific instrument makers in London who would make these things. I mean, Davy, in the end, had 2,000 plates in his plate battery, and that I can't remember. I think comes out at sort of 85 square meters of surface meters of plate, and that could sort of destroy most things if you put yourself in it. There's a wonderful letter where Henry Holland describes Davy sort of getting a bit of a shock when he was working his battery. So, but yeah,
so it's not. Go ahead.
I think you make some assumptions like sort of number of plates per trough, 4 inches by 4 inches, 6 by 6, depending. I mean, they come in all sorts of sizes, so it gives you an idea.
I imagine they had to be smaller plates.
And there were smaller places, yes. As I sort of said when I guided people around the eye, these were the mobile phone batteries of the day. Not sure anybody quite believed me, but never mind. Okay, any other questions either on Zoom or on YouTube? Because I've got one or two more. This is right up my street after all. Okay, well, while people are thinking questions, I will carry on. So Moyes supported Lavoisier and downplayed Priestley. Could you say a bit about that in terms of the idea of, I mean, I can certainly see the point. If you praise Lavoisier, you almost automatically have to uh, dismiss Priestley's sort of continuing commitment to phlogiston and so on.
Yes.
But did why? So I suppose what I ask is, why did Moyes support Lavoisier? I mean, do we know anything about how he encountered Lavoisier?
Well, this has perplexed me. I mean, I didn't go into it in the paper, but this is something I did think about. So one of the things, being, having worked on Scottish chemists and seeing their take of the French Revolution, sometimes is a bit different. The French chemical revolution is sometimes a bit different. Joseph Black, for example, the big chemist up there, took a while to actually come over and convert over to the Lavoisier's system because he had all sorts of reservations about it. And so Moyes, and I do talk about this earlier in the paper. So Moyes is Scottish. He's educated in Scotland. Actually, one of the conversations that Ewbank has with Elizabeth Hamilton, the author and philosopher living at the time, knew Moyes as a girl and had received letters from him that tutored her in some various subjects. And she told the story of Moyes starting off very poor and going off and learning chemistry and medicine at university. But the point being, he's Scottish. And one of the things that perplexed me when I read him on this was why he would have taken this position. But I suspect that it was probably linked to the fact that the Scots, like I said with Black, were not completely on board yet with Lavoisier, and somehow Moyes was not on board with that, because effectively he's only valuing the new nomenclature. He's not valuing the expertise of Priestley and the ability to isolate oxygen. He seems to be more interested in the theoretical aspect of it. So my answer to your question is that I think that when he is lecturing, because I forgot to mention for listeners that Moyes is blind, right? So he's a really interesting character in the sense that he does chemistry, but he's blind. And the way that Ewbank describes the lectures, and also if you read the lectures that I found from Philadelphia, it's very theoretically focused. And which, of course, if that's the case, if you're looking at whether or not you want to value Lavoisier over Priestley, well, Lavoisier's theory won out. And if you're highly theoretically focused and not so much interested in the practice of the experimentation itself, it makes sense why Moyes would favor Lavoisier. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
But I should mention that Moyes is an interesting character, and actually Ewbank, she wonders to herself after he's given the optics lecture, how talking about color is like for him since he can't see color. This is, so she's very intelligent, asking really interesting questions.
Was he blind from birth? Was he blind from birth?
I'm trying to think of Hamilton, because Hamilton gives an account of this. I actually talk about this in the paper as well. I don't think she says. I do know he was blind from very early on. No, I think he had a fever. I think so. He had originally some sight, and then early in his life he lost his sight. I think that's what it was, which of course is interesting. I hadn't known that until I read Ewbank's account of Hamilton's account of Moyes' early life. This is in the diary. She gets in another conversation with Hamilton. They're off talking somewhere, and Hamilton, it comes up that she's gone to Moyes' lecture that Ewbank has, and Hamilton gives the story, which I thought was really interesting.
Okay, right. And so I really must ask you about her opinion of Garnet, because it's a bit out on a limb, because most people who write about Garnet's lecturing say how good he was. And so saying that he was ungraceful and an automaton is a sort of bit away from what most people write about Garnet as a lecturer. And was she in London to attend an RI lecture, or would she have heard him say in Glasgow or somewhere like that?
So we're not sure where she saw him. The fact that Rachel Feldberg was really keen to try and find that one out, and she was not successful in finding out when or where. And neither was I, because I tried to find it as well. So here's the reason why I think she had that view. Ewbank had the view of Garnet. So this is where paying attention to her and her life is really important. And that's why the diary and having this project on her has really helped. She was a very keen attendee of theater. She constantly was going to theater. She was reading plays at home, and she was very much attuned to performance, and not necessarily just vocal performance, but also like presence. And you could see this in her comments about Moyes and also about Sylvester. And she's also very forthright when she thinks a performance just wasn't great, especially with actors coming up from London. I mean, some of her assessments of their abilities is really quite humorous, to be honest. So I think we've got two possibilities here. I think the reason why she gave this assessment of him was A, he wasn't as performative as she wanted to expect from a theatrical performance, which she would have been more familiar with at this point. It probably was her first ever experience that we know of with a chemical lecturer, right? So that is, in fact, I think that is probably what it was. But the other possibility is that Garnet could have had a bad day. It could have been, I don't know, a cold or something, and she could have seen him at a time when he was not characteristically himself. So I don't have that in the chapter because they're speculative, but if I was pressed on giving a reason why she was, pressing hard on Garnet, because I agree, the other accounts I've seen of Garnet is that he was relatively, a good lecturer. That's what my explanation would be. But that's why this kind of diary is quite interesting, because it leads to these kinds of questions. Is it possible that perhaps these people talking about Garnet may have been giving too much praise? I don't think that's the case, but I do think it shows that you have lecturers who are received differently by
Yeah.
people with different backgrounds and who could have had a bad day.
Yep. Well, we all have bad days. So the other thing that struck me, and so I'm afraid I missed who said this, but somebody who we talked about uses the phrase "science in its infancy." I wasn't clear whether that
Yes.
was Ewbank or Sylvester or
So that's
Sylvester.
Ewbank summarizing Moyes.
As Ewbank summarizing Moyes, okay,
Yes.
because that line of argument is something that Davy uses time and time and time again.
Oh, that's interesting.
It gets very repetitive after a while, but basically what the way Davy deploys that rhetoric is to say that because science is in its infancy, it needs support in order to justify its existence, when it will produce lots of goodies, both material and ideological, at a later stage. And therefore, Humphrey Davy, need to have lots more money to sort of carry on doing this science. I mean, he's quite blatant about it. And I'm just also wondering what the sort of content that Moyes, according to Ewbank, uses this phrase.
So that's interesting. So the context is in a conversation where she's been invited over. So she has a friend named Harriet Green, who is really a fascinating character herself. She's an artist. She is very involved in the literary scene in New York. She invites Moyes to tea, and also Ewbank, and also this local theologian, Dr. Berg. And Moyes is telling Berg this, this makes the point about infancy. So the reason why he says it, though, and again, this is just kind of supposition, is that he's been invited over and being given a meal, and in many respects, Davy's asking for big amounts of money here for support, but Moyes is just being thankful for a meal in many respects, and kind of giving them this to make them feel good about maybe him being there very nicely. But also at this time, he was doing his own experiments. And I've often wondered if he was using these opportunities to try and get supporters or patrons. He's blind. He does make a good amount of money on lecturing, but he does a lot of it. And I've often wondered if this was maybe a pitch to support the research that he was doing at the time. actually he was interested in galvanism and electricity.
Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. Well, I think I've run out of my own questions. So if nobody else has anything to add in sort of dying minutes of the lecture talk, then I'll draw everything to an end. So the next online seminar will be in January 25. Everything will be circulated nearer the time. We have the SHAC spring meeting on biographies of alchemists and chemists, which will be on the 29th of March at UCL. And we've got the postgraduate meeting on the 14th of January at St John's College, Oxford, and all details of all those have been circulated on our various sort of platforms. So I just need to sort of thank the sort of team who sort of works very hard behind the scenes to keep get these seminars up and running. That's sort of Anna Simmons, Rob Johnson, Caroline Cobble, Betty Martin, Chris Campbell, and Joe Hedison. But of course, and certainly not least, Matthew Eddy for giving this sort of really interesting talk. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing the book, I have to say. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And tell Joe Hedson I said hello. I haven't seen her in a while.
Right. Okay. Yep. Okie doke.